Wow, this is amazing. Andre, can you hear me? Okay, as long as Andre can hear me, she's in the back, we're good. So this is awesome. We're so happy to have you. We do have made a few seats down the middle, and we've got one here. Okay? All right. Welcome to the Daughters of the Utah Pioneer Macquarie Museum. I'm Nancy Carlton, and I'm part of the third weekend events committee. Even though I marched with a dog today, I'm supposed to be in a dog competition, so I'll be punching out of here as soon as the dog runs and I try to keep up. Okay, so we would like to welcome you today and thank you for coming to our third weekend event. This is the last one of this season. We do quit for the summer and then we start up again in September. If you follow our Macquarie Museum Facebook page, then you'll see that you get information on what's coming up. So this museum, this building was built in 1938, completed in 1938 to house, preserve, and protect artifacts, histories, and photographies of Washington County pioneers from 1853 to 1900. That's our realm. So we invite you to visit the museum after the event. It's upstairs, everything. There's a room here, but then you go upstairs and enjoy the many items on display as well as the gift shop to sell. And we actually have two of our newest books up here to show you. This is Utah Outlaw, Patrick Coughlin? I'm sorry, I don't know how to play that. So, the crime spree of a forgotten desperado. I understand he stole strawberries. And was convicted. Okay. So, we are supported by funding from the St. George City Rap Tax, the Washington County Rap Tax, and the Utah Arts and Museums. So please turn off your cell phones because you'll be embarrassed when it goes off. If you need to get out of the room and go to the restroom, it's out to your right. Go through the door and to the right. Today we have Loren Webb, and he is presenting on ghost towns of Utah, and he's going to tell you all kinds of stuff, but I'm going to tell you just a little about him. He's a retired educator and journalist, a lifelong resident of St. George. Anybody else in here lifelong residents of St. George? Yeah, I thought we'd have a few. He loves to tell stories, and we love him because he loves to tell stories in the history of Washington County. He will speak on Grafton, one of the most popular ghost towns, along with telling three lesser-known ghost towns of Fort Harmony, Hebron, and Schunesburg. So please welcome Loren Webb. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you everyone for coming. This is awesome to see so many people here today. I want to thank Nancy Carlton and the Daughters of Utah Pioneers for sponsoring this lecture. The DUP has been so good in helping other organizations, particularly the Washington County Historical Society, to find a home here. And so, again, I also wanted to thank Teresa Orton for her support as well. Okay, so as what was mentioned, I am going to be talking about those four ghost towns. So let's get started. Following the 1849-1850 expedition of the Southern Exploring Company, led by LDS Apostle Parley P. Pratt, he recommended settlement of several locations in the Virgin River Basin, along with many locations throughout Utah Territory. And of course, this is according to the book Over the Rim by William and Donna Smart. From 1855 to 1860, many of the settlers in the fertile Virgin River bottoms had experimented with cotton raising to make themselves more self-sustaining, and they found the climate that was similar to the southern United States. The trials were successful, which they reported to President Brigham Young. And then in 1861, as the Civil War promised a negative supply from the nation's southern states, President Young called 300 families from Salt Lake City and other nearby towns to pull up stakes and to move to Utah's Dixie to raise cotton. Now, the main purpose was to provide the saints with clothing and to sell any surplus to outsiders during the war. In this way, the church people would find another way to support themselves in the event that hostilities arose against them again. Many settlements were started along the Virgin River, all raising cotton and all having water and Indian problems. Two major events were common to all the towns in this area. The winter of 1861-1862 brought a terrible storm, peaking the first 2 weeks of January, which caused a horrendous flooding of the Virgin River and materially changed everyone's life. The river flooded quite often to some extent, but the 1862 flood was historical. And of course, the Fort Santa Clara was washed away. You know, it's really interesting when you look at where the Jacob Hamlin home is located now, and you see, if you were here in 2005 when we saw the major flooding, that water came right up to the grass line of the Jacob Hamlin home. So, yeah, it was really significant. Okay, so generally speaking, the reason many towns in Washington County failed was water, either too much of it, and several towns were literally flooded away or by drought. For many villages, streams ran dry or water tables dropped. The surrounding farms withered, eventually driving the townsfolk to other more suitable locations. The Black Hawk Indian War of 1866-1867 encouraged the church leaders to instruct all the residents of smaller settlements to move into a few larger ones for safety. This war engulfed the entire territory, which affected the resettling of several towns. So, what is a ghost town? The dictionary definition of ghost is any faint, shadowy semblance. Kind of interesting, right? The same applies to ghost towns, the shadowy remains of a town's former life and activity, even though in some instances a particular town may still be quite active, and this is according to Stephen Carr from Utah Ghost Towns. Doug Alder and Carl Brooks, who are authors of A History of Washington County, From Isolation to Destination, and I knew both of them very well, stated that people came to Dixie out of religious duty. And while the natural elements conspired against them, especially sparse water and scorching heat, the ranks of the pioneers were constantly thinned by disease, death, and departure. About 40 communities in Dixie were attempted. 20 of them continue to exist today. So that's a 50% success rate or a 50% failure rate, however you want to look at that. This area includes Washington County and adjacent areas, the Arizona Strip and Bunkerville and Mesquite, Nevada, and for a time, the Muddy River Settlement in Nevada. Each day was a struggle for survival for both leaders and followers, and this is according to Doug Alder and Carl Brooks. Okay, so we're going to talk about Fort Harmony first. Fort Harmony has one of the saddest histories of any town in Utah, culminating in its literal destruction. Where most of the towns were flooded by rivers, this town was flooded out from the sky. In 1854, John D. Lee and several other men established the town site along Canara Creek, a few miles above the previous location named Harmony, presumably named after Harmony, Pennsylvania, mentioned in early LDS church history, which had been settled on Ash Creek in 1852 and contained a few huts. The town was actually a fort built on rock footings 3 feet wide and 300 feet long, forming a square. Adobe formed much of the structural supports with log roofs. Water was ditched in from Ash, Red Butte, and Canara Creeks. Fort Harmony became the largest white settlement in the area and was named the county seat of the newly formed Washington County. How about that? So, okay, when you think about it, so there were 3 county seats: Harmony, Washington, and St. George. Okay, so it was the headquarters for the Indian Mission, and an Indian school was established there. John D. Lee was appointed Indian agent for the peaceful Indians who gathered from hundreds of miles around. It was from this place that John D. Lee left in September 1857 and shortly after participated in the Mountain Meadows Massacre to the west. Several children surviving the massacre were brought to Fort Harmony for temporary shelter. In 1859, the territorial legislature changed the county seat from Fort Harmony to Washington, where the bulk of the county's population then resided. In early 1861, President Brigham Young, on his tour to the southern Utah colonies, praised the industrious folks in Fort Harmony and stated that it was the best fort in the territory. On Christmas Day, 1861, the skies clouded over and rain started falling. Heavy winds also picked up the rain, which bit into the adobe walls. On New Year's Day, 1862, the temperature cooled enough so that the rain turned to snow, which, instead of running off, piled up against the walls. Then, during a warming spell in the next few days, as the rain continued, the snow melted, and the heavy standing water penetrated the walls. The underground rooms became flooded, and the fort walls began crumbling away under the driving, relentless rain. Outside the fort, the barns collapsed, one by one, and still the rain fell. By the middle of January, there were many large gaping holes in the walls and roofs of the fort. Finally, on January 18th, with no end in sight of the storm and destruction, all the families except the Lees were moved from the fort and tried to find shelter in their wagons and other windbreaks. The sun was seen on January 31st, 1862, the first time in 29 days. Then a blizzard set in and strong winds battered the fort. More walls crumbled and roofs crashed down, and the Lee's dwelling filled with 3 feet of water. On February 7th, 1862, 44 days after the beginning of the storm, Lee's wife, Sarah Caroline Williams, gathered her children to get them out of the fort. At that exact moment, a strong blast of wind blew down a section of the wall, killing 2 of the children. Their names are George Albert Lee and Margaret Ann Lee, and they barely missed 2 others. Now, I just wanted to tell you that in a field trip that I took that was organized by Mark Harless, who is the Washington City and the New Harmony president of the historical societies in both of those areas, he organized a field trip up there, and I was able to go along with others to the private cemetery where the 2 Lee children are buried, and there's just one marker listing for both of them. After the storm, the mourning settlers decided not to rebuild. Half of them moved 5 miles west on Ash Creek, founding New Harmony. The other half moved up the valley and founded Canaryville. So just kind of backtrack, so we have Fort Harmony, we have Harmony, Fort Harmony, and then New Harmony. Okay, so let's talk about Hebron. In 1862, several St. George families, including John and Charles Pulsifer, were driving a band of church cattle from the desert lands around St. George up to Diamond Valley and later Mountain Meadows. The men explored a large area south of the Escalante Desert and found a suitable location for settlement. Encouraged by the local Paiutes, the pioneers brought their families and organized a ranching community called Shoal Creek. The Pulsifer's father, prominent LDS leader Zara Pulsifer, moved here in the fall of 1862 and became the local presiding church officer. And by the way, there's a new book out about Zara Pulsifer by Reed Nielsen, and I want to get a copy of that. It looks like it's going to be really interesting. Some 6 years later, the community was named Hebron because of the similarity with the biblical settlement mentioned in the Old Testament. The new Hebron was at first a straggling collection of houses and farms along Shoal Creek and its springs west of what is now Enterprise. Although the town was far removed to the west of most of the marauding Indians during the Black Hawk War, the local Paiutes expressed strong feelings over the intrusion of the Mormon settlers. The Saints moved closer together and built a fort of logs hauled from Pine Valley with a spring in the middle. The settlers thrived in this location. Cattle feed was excellent. Garden crops were grown, dairy goods were produced, enough for the town, plus plenty to sell to the mines in eastern Nevada, including Pioche, Nevada, and to other towns in Utah. In 1867, a large log schoolhouse was built, which also served for Saturday night dances and church meetings on Sunday. It wasn't until 1868 that the town received its name. By then, storms had washed out trails between distant locations of the loosely settled community, and travel became difficult. The present town site was surveyed near the old fort with Main Street extending east and west. The community building was in the center, and soon quite a number of substantial stone, brick, and lumber stores, shops, and homes were built on both sides of the street on the bench above the creek. Hebron was the focal point for trade with numerous mines in the area, providing beef, greens, milk, and hay for many years. As with numerous colonies in the South, low water contributed to a lot of grief and toil. A wooden flume was built from a nearby spring into the farm areas. In 1885, the flume fell under a siege of wet weather and was not rebuilt. A longer canal was built instead. Although substantial, it was destined to be temporary, as the stream channel was constantly changing due to periodic floods. By 1900, many residents were ready to try settling elsewhere. The morning of November 17, 1902, was clear and beautiful in Hebron, a small cattle ranching community on the south end of the Escalante Desert in Washington County. Chris Ammon, a Norwegian stonemason, was laying the last bit of rock on a gable end of the Frank Hunt home when shortly before noon, the rock Ammon was placing began to bounce in his hand and refused to lie still. It only took Ammon a split second to realize the whole earth was shaking. Hebron was experiencing an earthquake. This is according to Paul Reeve, who wrote a history of Enterprise. Orson W. Huntsman was also outside that day working on his workbench under a willow shed when he began to teeter to and fro. Settlers for hundreds of miles felt similar rumblings, but Hebron was the hardest hit. Huntsman witnessed, quote, chimneys falling from housetops in every direction and porches crashing to the earth, unquote. Terrified women and children came running and screaming from their homes to gather in the streets. One woman who was disturbed by the quake ran outside with her two little girls, one tucked securely under her arm and the other clutched tightly by the hand. Upon reaching safety, she said to a friend that she and her children were unharmed, but, quote, every damn dish in the house was broken, unquote. Almost every home in Hebron was made of brick or rock and was damaged, some so extensively they were no longer safe to occupy. Aftershocks continued at intervals during the afternoon and persisted for several weeks, so many residents felt hesitant to sleep in their homes. By Christmas, people had partially recovered from the scare, but talk in town centered on moving from Hebron. As a result, on January 11, 1903, the men of Hebron met to discuss moving to Enterprise, a new community 6 miles east. And by June 1903, Edward H. Snow and Thomas Cottam, leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, met with Hebron residents to consider moving to the town of Enterprise, since it offered the best future for them and their children. Following a series of negotiations over water rights, the transfer to Enterprise began. So, as Hebron withered and died, Enterprise began to grow. By September 1905, Hebron was largely abandoned. While the town site of Hebron has never been rebuilt, Omar and K. Gene Matthews and Jerry and Katie Lewis eventually acquired land north of the town site, as well as acquiring the old Hebron Cemetery in 1998. Omar died in 2000, and K. Gene later married Steve Hales. He died in 2021, and so this leaves K. Gene as the sole owner of the cemetery, and I'm proud to say that she's my sister-in-law. So, yeah. Okay, so the cemetery remains open to the public, and a historic marker was installed in front of the fenced-in cemetery. The cemetery is located on a dirt road about a mile north of Old State Highway 120, 5.6 miles west of Enterprise. Since then, several other families have built homes in the Hebron area, including the Kayleen Preston family, Ted and Sherry Jacobson, Jeff and Marilee Jacobson, K. Gene Matthews, and Bart and Dory Comby families. Okay, so let's talk about Grafton. Named after an early settler, Grafton, and this is kind of interesting. So this is the original, one of the original headstones to welcome people to the Hebron Cemetery. And then the marker inside the chain link fence is more modern, and it also gives a much more detailed history of the Hebron Cemetery. Okay, so Grafton. It's probably the most photographic ghost town in Utah. It appears in several ghost town books, including Stephen Carr's Historical Guide to Utah Ghost Towns and George Thompson's Some Dreams Die, Utah Ghost Towns and Lost Treasures. The town has also added atmosphere to movies such as Ramrod and Arizona Kid, The Red Fury, and of course, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. According to Southern Utah University historian Wayne Hinton, there were 3 types of towns in early Utah: industrial towns, railroad towns, and agricultural towns. Grafton was a Mormon agricultural community. Unlike mining towns where the population was single, male, and rowdy, the people of Grafton were concerned about schools, hospitals, churches, and the family. Everybody's business was their neighbor's business. Of the 537 communities established in Utah between 1847 and 1900, only 46 failed. Grafton was one of them. The reason? Water, and a streak of bad luck. At the original site of the village, a mile below the present town site of Grafton, it once rained 40 days and 40 nights. And down through the years, floods have been as common as colds. After each washout, the settlers had to redig the irrigation ditches. Some of the settlers remarked with grim humor that making ditches at Grafton was like the house washing. It was a weekly chore. The problem was amplified because of the necessity of building a canal on each side of the river to supply water to the narrow strips of bottomlands on the river's banks. Old Grafton was settled in December 1859, and among the old settlers were Nathan C. Tenney, an Indian missionary, and 3 other families. One of the first things they did was to build a dam across the river so they could take water out for irrigation. This is according to historian Andrew Carl Larson. And it's cited by Dixie College history professor Robert Slack. He wrote a paper, and I took several classes from Robert Slack. He was like one of my mentors, just a great scholar. Their intention, based on suggestions from Mormon leaders, was primarily to grow cotton because it was thought the land and climate were well adapted to cotton. In October 1861, when 300 families were called to settle Dixie, several families settled at Grafton, with Franklin W. Young presiding over the settlement. By December 1861, residents of the Virgin River area had petitioned the Utah Territorial Legislature for $1,000 to improve the road from Harmony to Tokerville and then extend it to Grafton. And this is according to James Jones, who is the author of Old Grafton. During that same month, the rains began to fall, and it continued into January 1862. It's during this time that the most famous flood story of Grafton occurred. How many of you know this story? Okay, at least one individual knows the story. It's during this time that the most famous flood story of Grafton occurred. It involved the Nathan Tenney family. It seems Mrs. Olive Strong Tenney. Mrs. Olive Strong Tenney was in labor when everything outside began to be washed down the river. Seeing his house wasn't in the safest of places, Nathan Tenney and a couple of neighbors put the woman into a wagon box and somehow managed to float and tug her to higher ground. There she gave birth. The couple was so affected by the whole adventure, they named the child Marvelous Flood Tenney. Friends called him Marv. Andrew Carl Larson also writes of the flood. The flood of January 1862 inundated the whole valley and wiped out the new town, taking houses down the river and leaving terror-stricken inhabitants without shelter in midwinter. At Virgin, one of the settlers wrote that, quote, "The houses of Grafton came floating down with the furniture, clothing, and other property of the inhabitants, some of which was hauled out of the water at this place, including 3 barrels of molasses." Unquote. Soon after the flood, Grafton was moved a mile upstream and built on the south bank of the Virgin. The settlers also faced other trials. They had been sent to plant and supply cotton, according to Stephen Carr. He wrote, "So that's what they did. Then they realized they hadn't planted enough corn, and they went hungrier than usual that winter." Meanwhile, settlers went to work to build a new ditch, costing $5,000. During that time, the residents lived in tents, wagon boxes, dugouts, and log cabins. And this is according to Leon McMullen, a book called Grafton, Ghost Town, Honoring Our Ancestors. There are a lot of great resources about Grafton. These were later replaced by adobe buildings, sod logs, frame houses, and brick. One of the first settlers to die was 9-year-old Joseph Field, who is buried in the Grafton Cemetery. He died February 5th, 1862. The Deseret News recorded that Field was leading 2 horses down to the river when passing a man carrying a couple of boards on his shoulder. One of the animals spooked, and the lariat which Field was leading the horse got fastened around his wrist. He was dragged 2.5 blocks before the lariat could be taken off. The child died shortly afterwards. In addition to regular flooding, Grafton residents had other problems with insects. Thomas Woodbury, a Grafton farmer and nurseryman, wrote to the Deseret News, "Cabbage are about as lousy as they can be. There are no good cabbage raised in this part of the country. Beets are a middling crop. Squashes are eat up by the bugs during the summer." But he reported that onions and tobacco did well. In the same letter, he writes, "The apple seeds were coming good when the worms commenced cutting them down." Going on the offensive, Woodbury applied tar around the trees in the orchard, then dug a ditch around the trees. Quote, "Then I commenced battle against all the worms that were on the inside of this enclosure. When they were conquered, the red ants came up out of the ground by millions, or in numbers too numerous to count, and were very destructive. I was fighting these ants and gophers not a little all summer." By July 1864, the census listed 28 families totaling 168 people residing in Grafton. While farming occurred in Grafton, some residents, such as Alonzo Russell, also farmed in what is now Zion National Park. Russell had a cornfield where the Zion Lodge now stands. In 1864, another tragedy struck the town when Loretta Russell, 14, and Elizabeth Woodbury, 13, were killed while swinging on an old cotton gin mill. A single red sandstone marker in the Grafton Cemetery marks the graves of both girls. Yet another tragedy struck 2 years later, when Robert and Isabella Berry and Robert's brother Joseph Berry were murdered by Indians on April 2nd, 1866 at Short Creek while returning to their home in Berryville in Long Valley. Long Valley would be like Orderville and Glendale. All 3 are buried in the Grafton Cemetery. In January 1866, Grafton became the first county seat of Kane County. But because of Indian troubles throughout Utah, several towns, including Grafton, were later abandoned. Grafton residents agreed to relocate on June 10, 1866, to Rockville. Over the next few years, the individual homes were moved to Rockville, leaving nothing but farms in Grafton. The Grafton ward was abandoned as a result of the move in March 1868. Some residents moved back to Grafton after Indian troubles passed, but many others never returned. Alonzo Russell never left. When asked why, he said, "Brigham Young called me down to settle it. He didn't give me a release. I'm not going to ask him about it." This time, Grafton was organized as a dependent branch of Rockville with Alonzo Russell as presiding elder. By 1877, the town's population grew enough to reorganize a ward with Russell named as bishop. In 1868, residents decided it was time to replace the old log church with a new one. The building was made of adobe bricks. obtained locally, and lumber was hauled from Mount Trumbull 75 miles to the south. The building served the community as a church on Sunday and school on weekdays, as well as night school for adults. It was the place where funerals were held and most probably weddings and wedding dances. There were also many community dances held in the building, which attracted people from surrounding communities. The building was dedicated as a church July 8, 1888. School operated from November to March, and it continued to serve as a school until 1919, when Grafton's population dropped so low that remaining children went to Rockville to school. My grandmother, Annie Mae Isom Webb Connell, remembers teaching school in Grafton. In her life story, she writes, quote, "In October 1898, I went to Grafton to teach school. The school board wanted me to board around with the patrons, which I refused to do. Will and Mary Isom had a large family," this is in Virgin, by the way, "but I eventually stayed with them. I had all grades in my school, including 3 boys 1 year younger than I was. My, was I glad when that school was over. Grafton was 6 miles from home, so I rode back and forth on horseback most of the time, and I believe I had some of the best and gentlest horses owned by Grafton people, who vied with each other in letting me have their horses to ride." So here's my grandmother commuting by horseback between Virgin and Grafton and crossing that Virgin River every day. I just thought that was a pretty amazing story. Now, I don't know why she didn't want to live in Grafton. She doesn't say, but anyway. Mary Bertha Woodhull fondly remembers growing up in Grafton. Quote, "When we were teenagers, we had a lot of fun. We danced what you call old-time dances, Virginia reel, quadrille, minuet, three-step, Danish slide-off, round dances, and many others. When anyone would get married, we'd have a dance. It sure was fun. The dances were really started by us young kids, but the older people came just because they liked to dance. The cowboys liked to come to the dances too. They worked out there at Canaan, at the big cattle ranch and cane beds. Oh, they loved Grafton. They would sing and dance. Oh, it was really a pleasure to have those guys around. Grafton had more music than any place I have ever seen. Nearly every night or every few nights, everybody in town with music would get out there in front of the school church building and start playing." In addition to flooding and other factors doomed Grafton's future, as the floods slowly washed away the farmland, the economy slowly changed to cattle raising, and the land would not support as many families. So slowly people moved away, Jones stated, and in 1907, so many residents had moved away that the Grafton ward was changed to a branch. The final blow to the town of Grafton was perhaps the Hurricane Canal. Many of the men were stockholders in the canal company and worked on the canal as a means of gaining homes and land in Hurricane. Ironically, as one town was being created, several others, including Grafton, were dying. The finishing of the Hurricane Canal represented not only a change for the residents of Grafton, but a whole change in the lifestyle of Utah. Now, this is according to James T. Jones. Residents were either moving to Rockville, Hurricane, or just slowly dying off. By 1919, most of the residents had moved and the school was closed. By 1920, there were only 3 families left, and in 1921, the LDS branch ceased to exist. Apparently, some residents stayed until 1935. After years of neglect and vandalism, the Grafton Heritage Partnership Project was organized in June 1997 as a volunteer nonprofit organization governed by a board of trustees selected from participating organizations and families. The partnership unites the interests of federal, state, local governments, private landowners, and community groups to effectively work towards preserving Grafton as an historic site. If any of you have been out to Grafton, you know what I'm talking about. It's really well maintained today. It's a great place to visit. They have a lot of educational signs that are out there that talk about the various buildings. Just a great place to visit. Okay, let's talk about Schunesburg, also known as Shonesburg. While some people believe Grafton is the most scenic ghost town in Utah, Shonesburg, or Schunesburg, is probably one of the better preserved and one of the least accessible. Located on the Virgin River's East Fork as it flows through Parunaweep Canyon is Oliver DeMille's two-story cut stone house. Near the abandoned house, home is a rickety fence surrounding a tiny cemetery. Further north, the fence along Zion National Park's boundary is visible. In addition, remains of a few chimneys and portions of walls are the only clues that a town once existed here. Long before the white man invaded the Virgin River Valley, the Indians lived here, according to Stephen Carr. Several of the Indians along the river had tiny farms to sustain them and give variety to their game diet. One Paiute native named Shunes, or Shones, had a little spread in a small valley on the Virgin River's East Fork. In 1861, Oliver DeMille and several other families purchased land from Shones, and the settlement became known as Shonesburg. Stephen Carr states that the settlers paid Shones little for the land, so he accepted it as a down payment, and continued living among the pioneers, doing some work and begging the rest of the time. Shones may have known more than he let on as he watched the settlers clear the land, dig ditches, plant crops and orchards, and maintain them, so they reaped much larger fruits and vegetables than the old Indian had, and he benefited more than if he had held the land, according to Carr. The following information on Shonesburg is largely taken from an article written by Janice Forrest DeMille in Hurricane. So she notes that while the neighboring canyons of Zion National Park are yearly visited by thousands, Parunaweep Canyon and remains of the Pioneer Village are rarely seen. It was LDS President Brigham Young's call of pioneers for the Dixie Cotton Mission on October 7, 1861, which was the impetus for Shonesburg's start. Among those called from Sanpete County besides Oliver DeMille were George Petty, Hiram Stevens, Alma Millett, Hardin Whitlock, and Charlie Clapper and their families. Some of the families spent part of the winter below Rockville, where the floods of 1861-62 washed away their farm, causing them to move on to a new location. Traveling 2 miles up the Virgin to where it forked, they followed the East Fork. Once a site was chosen, available land was divided into small lots to accommodate newcomers. Oliver DeMille II stated that 10 families made their homes there at that time. A town site was then laid out on the northwest corner or side of the river. Most residents built log cabins and immediately began working on a ditch to bring water to their farms. The residents also cleared the land, planted orchards and vineyards, planted corn and made the irrigation ditch. Using pick, shovel, crowbar, and scraper, they also built dugways along the river for a road into the valley. After all this work, only a small crop was harvested. They also built dams across the river, only to see them washed away by unpredictable floods. Nevertheless, by July 1864, Henry Stevens presided over 7 families, or 45 persons, and 75 acres of cotton. A year later, Shonesburg residents finally had a good harvest of cotton, corn, and cane. Cotton was also used by some people for beds. During the Southern Utah Indian Wars of 1866-67, LDS authorities in St. George advised settlers to gather to Rockville. So Grafton, Springdale, Shonesburg, and Virgin residents came with only the basic necessities. Some moved in with relatives, but most camped outside with their wagons, living in their wagons. While some men kept watch for Indian attacks, others went in groups to farm nearby fields. Following resettlement of Shonesburg in 1868, a windlass was built over the ledge at the head of narrow Shonesburg Canyon to take the mail up and down the mountain without climbing the trail. Mail carriers were hired to go from Tokerville to Shonesburg Canyon and back. Lorenzo and Horace Slack, carriers at the time, would leave Tokerville Monday morning, go to Shonesburg the first day, and camp there that night. The next day, they went 4 miles to the head of the canyon, ran the mail up the windlass, took the Kanab mail that came down the windlass, and went back to Shonesburg, for the night, then returned to Tokerville. They made 2 mail trips a week. When high water prevented crossing the river, they stationed someone on both sides and ran the mail across on a wire. A mule was used to pack the wire. The only public building in Shonesburg was the old log schoolhouse built about 1870, used for public purposes, including church services, and I'm pretty sure it does not exist anymore. Before 1866, no Shonesburg ward organization existed, so residents went to Rockville when they could. Later, an LDS church branch was formed in Shonesburg with Oliver DeMille, the presiding elder. School terms were only 3 months because students had to work early in the spring and late in the fall. LDS President Brigham Young had sent the saints to raise cotton and make wine, but the settlers grew all kinds of produce, including cane, corn, cotton, watermelons, peaches, apples, pears, apricots, plums, and grapes. Little wheat was grown, however, and usable farmland ranged from about 4 miles up the river from town to 2 miles below. So not a lot of arable land there. The produce was then sent north and traded for flour and potatoes. Although life was hard, the settlers were almost self-sustaining. The women and girls corded, spun, and wove the raw cotton into cloth, then made their own clothes by hand because they had no machines. Shonesburg residents also had large families with just midwives and no doctors to help. Several women died in childbirth. Home remedies were used, and some of the women used their skills as midwives and nurses. There were other residents, experts like Joseph Millet Jr., a master of basket making. Using willows from above Shonesburg, he made baskets to sell, then later taught others how. He also made shoes by hand for all of his older children. He was a carpenter by trade, but also a proficient blacksmith, mason, farmer, casket maker, and shoemaker. Can you imagine all of those tasks? Around 1880, Oliver DeMille and his family moved into the 2-story rock house on the hill. Each of the wives had their own apartment and fireplace, while on the upper floor was a larger room where dances were held. Building on the hill gave a good view of the surrounding country in case of Indian attacks, and was also considered a more healthy spot than the valley. Because a breeze, by the way, ask me about this photo and I'll tell you later, okay? Because a breeze kept mosquitoes away. Joseph Millet Jr. did the masonry with Christian Larson helping on the carpenter work. The DeMille house, however, was never completely finished the way Oliver planned. When Brigham Young came to the southern settlements, he on occasion stayed at the DeMille home. But very few celebrations were held in Shonesburg. The people usually went to Rockville or other early settlements for holidays. Because it was hard to get around and with not much to do, they entertained themselves. Shonesburg was particularly known for good dances. Folks came from miles around to dance at the DeMille Rock House, while afterwards the fiddlers would be paid in produce for the dance music. But year after year, floods came and washed away more land. It's like kind of a recurring story here. Consequently, families began to leave as their farms were washed away. Because many Rockville settlers at one time moved away, Shonesburg people bought their places. Finally, only a few farms were left in Shonesburg. The year 1897 was the last year enough children were available to hold school. By 1900, everyone was gone except Oliver DeMille and his children. Years before, DeMille wanted to move away, but Brigham Young had told him to stay, saying, the day would come when there would be a family for every acre of land. Oliver was obedient to counsel, but conditions did not get better, and the floods washed away enough land that finally there was a family for every acre left. After 41 years of struggle, the Shonesburg Canyon, where the old Shonesburg town site was and where Springdale Fruit Company once operated, and so it just it disappeared. At present, the entire town site is on private property and is off limits to tourists. The Shonesburg property was owned by Jim Trees, who died June 2nd, 2008 in Tiburon, California. Trees was a faculty member of Harvard Business School who helped found the Grand Canyon Trust. Tree established the Springdale Ranch in 1982. Under Tree's ownership, the ranch began growing organic fruit, including Utah's first organic apple orchard. By the way, I never got to meet Jim Trees in person, but I did talk to him on the phone when I was a reporter for the Spectrum newspaper. And it was about when he built he built a reservoir on his property there, and he was able to get a lot of state funding for his private reservoir. And when my story came out, he called me on the phone and he said, the first thing he asked, he said, "Are we still friends?" And I said, "Yes, we are." I said, "I just have to tell, I have to tell the truth like I know it." So, and we stayed, I think we stayed pretty good friends, but I never got to meet him, and I kind of regret that. I wish that I'd had the chance to have met him. The Schoensberg property was sold to Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft, under the name Sanctuary Ranch LLC for, get this, $25 million. On March 13th, 2021, Allen's successors, since Allen had died in 2018, sold the property to Parunaweep Canyon LLC for $27 million. Ryan Lee, Jeff Lee, and Ben Peterson, partners in Parunaweep Canyon LLC, have plans to build a hotel along with short-term rentals capable of serving up to 350 nightly guests. Up to 25 private homes are planned, as well as a swimming pool, spa, horse center, and tent campsites. And that's according to a January 13th, 2025 St. George News article. The project will start with 280 acres and has 4 phases totaling up to 1,960 acres, 0.67 acres that could be developed according to the Trees Ranch project plan. Plans to build the hotel necessitated a zoning change for the ranch, which was approved by the Washington County Planning Commission on October 1st, 2024. The change allows for increased development on the property, which was previously zoned as open space. Now, apparently, Ryan Lee took issue with the St. George News article, so I'm going to tell you this other article. So Ryan Lee told SF Gate, which stands for San Francisco Gate, by phone that his visions for the property include 17 freestanding wilderness pods and 11 luxury canvas tents spread out across 25 acres. The rest of the ranch, he said, will be left as open space, according to a January 18th, 2025 SF Gate article. Meanwhile, the only thing running free through the town site is the Virgin River, which ultimately was cause for the town's abandonment. Thank you. Hey.
Just a couple minutes. Want to take questions?
Sure.
Anybody
Yeah.
have a question?
We said to ask about the
That one picture.
Okay. So it's really hard to get into Schoensberg. I call it Schoensberg. I prefer the term Schoensberg. But the only time that the public is allowed to go into Schoensberg is on Memorial Day to see the cemetery. And generally speaking, you have to be a relative to get in. And I always felt like it was a pretty hard and fast rule. But so I used some of my connections. I contacted the Hurricane Valley Heritage Museum, and I talked to Phyllis Lawton, and she got me in touch with the Hurricane branch of the Sons of the Utah Pioneers, and I was able to get permission to go in there, okay, and on Memorial Day. And so I was able to go in. I went up to the Oliver DeMille, and you'll notice that those photos were taken in 2025, okay? And so the view that you have looking down on the valley, those are all relatives, all those vehicles that were parked there, those are all relatives of Oliver DeMille. Well, I went to the cemetery thinking, of course, I didn't have any relatives, but lo and behold, I found, I think her name was Mary Parker, and she's buried in the Schoensberg Cemetery, and I'm related to her. So because my great-grandmother, Alice Parker Isom, she married George Isom, and they lived in Virgin, I'm related to the Parkers. So I was so excited to find out that, yes, I do have a relative in the Schunesburg Cemetery. Yes.
If they own that town, the ghost town, are there any protections for the historic?
I think all of that where they're developing is away from the historical sites. So the developers have promised that the cemetery and the Oliver DeMille home will be protected into the future. So it's an amazing place to go see, but it's very difficult to get in, you know. And I've been wanting to go see that. Now I have to tell you, I've seen the Oliver DeMille place before. When I was 16 years old, I went on a camping trip with some other explorers in my LDS ward, and our leader was Maurice Gubler, and he took us up into Parunaweep Canyon, and it was just magical. You know, here I am in this branch of the Virgin River. We're camped up in there in the beautiful scenery, and the next morning we see this stone building up on top of the hill. It's the Oliver DeMille house, and we got to see the cemetery. And what I remember is the cemetery was a very small cemetery, and it's my belief, I think the cemetery was moved, because what I saw when I was 16 years old was really close down on the hill, or just down off the hill. So, and then I got to go in when I was around 21, 22 years old with a buddy of mine. We both worked, we were summer employees with the Pine Valley Ranger District of the U.S. Forest Service. And so I told him about this, and so we went in there and we got to see it at that time as well. Didn't have all those restrictions that it has now. But so I've been in there, I've been able to go in there 3 times. So, yes?
Lauren, could you see from Eagle Craig's over Schunesburg?
You can, from Eagles Crag, you can see the reservoir.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember because I went over to Eagle Crag's trail once, and I did get to see the reservoir, but I don't think you can see, I'm pretty sure you can't see the house. Yes?
Now, how do those towns that are now in private hands, how does the land transfer work? If it was originally a town, it's abandoned, does it go back to the church, the state, and then how does that work?
It just sat there for years until Jim Trees came in and bought it from, I think there was some other people that owned it, and then Jim Trees went ahead and bought the property.
But is the state, does it sort of revert?
It's been privately owned ever since. Okay? And just like the Hebron Cemetery is privately owned by my sister-in-law, you know, but it's open to the public. That's the great thing about the Hebron Cemetery is it's open to the public. No restrictions.
But would those original town sites divided into lots, would the settlers own their own piece of land, or?
Sometimes they just kind of, things just like sit, and then until somebody comes and purchases the land. I wanted to mention that if you're wanting to get permission, contact the Lee family. They're the ones that I had to go through to get permission to go to the Schunesburg Oliver DeMille home. Yes?
Is that town at the bottom of that mail drop canyon? Is it at the bottom of that? Do you know where the mail drop is?
Yeah. I think it's at the bottom of that canyon. Yes, it's kind of right at the entrance to Parunaweep Canyon. Yes?
Isn't Zion National Park to the east?
Zion National Park is like surrounds it.
Okay.
It just kind of, at least surrounds it from the, kind of from the north and the,
Can you come down the mail trail into it?
you know, I've never been on that mail trail, so I can't tell you.
That mail drop is about 300 feet high.
Yes.
Way up.
Yeah, it's way up there.
From there you can go.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly where the mail drop was. I've never been to the mail drop. Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about the Blackhawk tribe? And because I haven't heard of that name in this area.
They called it the Black Hawk War, but it's interesting because you have Shoshone Indians, you have Ute Indians, you have Paiutes and Navajos, and the Black Hawk. Good question. I'm not sure. I'll have to go back and research that, but I don't recall Blackhawks being specifically in Utah territory. Maybe Doug can clarify that for us.
Blackhawk was the name of the chief, not of his tribe.
Yes, there we go. So I knew it, I've always think about it as the Ute Indians, yes.
Just add something here. I'm not trying to steal anybody's thunder, but I'm going to read something. Is that all right?
What's it about?
It's about the Schuensburg house itself.
How long is it?
About this long.
It's up to you. Yes, you're
Stand
welcome
up.
to.
Stand up.
Go ahead.
It's a photo taken here. And it says, it was at one time the Millette home in Schuensburg. It was built on private land near the entrance to Zion National Park, built under the supervision of the temple builder Artemis Millette and sons Alma, or you can pronounce it Millett. The Millett families accepted a call to supervise the cattle operation of the church in Spring Valley, west of Cedar City, and now part of Nevada. The DeMille family intermarried with the Millett family and enjoyed this large stone structure and used it for community functions until 1900. My grandmother, Mary Millett, a daughter of Alma Millett Jr., was born in Schuensburg and recalls moving from Schuensburg to Zenith or Mesa, Arizona, when she was 3 years old. I knew my grandmother, Mary Millett Davis, and paid tribute to the heritage of the Millett line from whom I am descended. Robin Burt Davies, November 2010.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That's great. Okay, any other questions before I sit down?
He is the third grandson and granddaughter of Artemis Millett, the temple builder.
Wow.
Who owned this place.
That's really cool. Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
Back to this, you said that they've promised that they're going to maintain these historic structures. Are there no, as far as the government goes, to try to protect these sites where you don't have to get a promise from them?
This is private property, so that's there's a fair amount of concern from like Zion National Park and some of the other surrounding state agencies, but it's private land, so yeah.
Okay, we
What
thank
else?
you all
Okay.
for coming today, and
Thank
we
you
thank
so much.
Loren. We appreciate him.
Oh, thank you.
We hope to see you in September. Good job. Very good job.
Yeah, thank you.
Several historians here,
Where
right?
did I put my?
It's down here.
Oh, down here.